We're here with Philip R. Ratcliffe. He's the author of Mississippi John Hurt, His Life, His Times, His Blues. Welcome to Mississippi and America.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be here.
Excellent. You've already been to Grenada and you've been to Memphis. Tell us, how were things that close to John Hurt's Avalon? What was it like to sign a book right there?
Well, it was great. And before that, we were also in Tennessee near Nashville as well, and we did a signing there with a whole lot of interest. But Grenada especially was interesting because that was where John, very close to where John lived, and where he died, of course, in 1966. So all of the local dignitaries showed up there. There was a big crowd at the signing, and it was just a great buzz, the whole thing.
Fantastic. Now, for those who don't know, who are going to come to our website and see this video, let's get some basics. Who was Mississippi John Hurt in a nutshell?
He was a Mississippi farmer and sharecropper. He was born in 1892, and he liked the music that he heard around the hills. He's just on the edge of the Delta in the hill country of Mississippi, and he learned to play the guitar when he was just 9 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And he worked as a sharecropper, as I say, most of his life, and by a quirk of coincidence, he was recommended to the OK Record Company and made some records in 1928.
Okay.
The Big
So
Depression
he would have
came
been
in.
30. How old would have you been when it was first recorded?
Yeah, early 30s kind
I
of thing.
see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so he thought, well, this is an opportunity to make some money, because being black in Mississippi in those days, you didn't earn a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
But of course the Big Depression came in, and that was the end of that, and he went back to being a farmer for 35 years until he was rediscovered in 1963.
In 1963. Now, why has there never been a biography about him? Your biography, is the first. Why?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. It's a really interesting one. I don't know. I came along pretty late in the game, 2003. I decided to do this.
Mm-hmm.
But the editor of this series really gave an interesting response when I asked him that question. And he figured it was because perhaps people didn't really think that John Hurt had a particularly interesting life. He was a farmer in Mississippi. But I found that being a farmer in Mississippi was a really interesting kind of life, and then his subsequent rediscovery and all of the excitement of his life on the East Coast. I figured he led a pretty interesting life, and I'm really glad nobody had done it before.
Now, you say rediscovery in 1963.
Yeah.
What do we mean by that? People may think, of a discovery of a musician now, and they think of American Idol or something incredible happening in television. What happened when someone like John Hurt was rediscovered?
Well, he was discovered the first time on the recommendation of a local white fiddle player in 1928 who recommended him to the OK Record Company, and John then made records in Memphis and New York in 1928. The Big Depression came in, as I say, and nothing happened, so he went back to being a farmer. So 35 years later, there was a huge interest being shown in his music, but John didn't realise this. People were picking up his old records, were becoming collector's items, and people were trying to learn how to play this incredible music that he plays, and wondering how they could do that, how they could find. And somebody said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could find these old guys, if they were still alive, they could teach us. And eventually, this guy called Tom Hoskins had heard a record which was called Avalon Blues. And the first line in the record was, "Avalon's my hometown, it's always on my mind." And he figured, John Hurt's telling us where he lives. And to cut a long story short, he jumped in a car and drove all the way from Washington, D.C. down to Avalon, Mississippi, and stopped at Stinson's store on Highway 7 and asked the guy at the gas station, "Did you ever hear of Mississippi John Hurt?" And to his astonishment, the reply was, "Yeah, if you go the third mailbox up on the left, you'll find John." And there he was, unknown that the rest of the world was looking for him. Mm-hmm. So that was, in the sense, his rediscovery. He was discovered the second time.
Mm-hmm. And after that rediscovery, the magic of his music was picked up by a lot of people. I mean, the British blues revival was underway, and people like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards are listening to the way that John Hurt plays country blues.
Yeah.
And what was the magnification? What was the ramifications of his fame right after those recordings?
Well, interestingly, John didn't have any big star cover any of his music. Like, for example, Skip James was rediscovered around the same time in '64, I think that was. But of course, Cream and some of these big bands covered some of his music, and there was a big, strong connection. That never really happened with John Hurt, but there was this group of aficionados, particularly on the east coast of the US, who loved his music and were desperate to know more about it. And his rediscovery, suddenly John Hurt was in all the coffee houses on the east coast. He was making records, and unlike a lot of the blues guys, he was playing a kind of music that really appealed to a very wide audience. It's not blues, it's more lively, it's kind of ragtime, old-timey music, and it appealed to a much bigger audience. And without doubt, although I'm biased a little bit on this, but without doubt, John Hurt was really the most popular of all of the rediscovered black musicians at that time.
Wow. And how old was he by '63 if he was born in 1892?
He was 71.
My gracious me.
When he was rediscovered. And interestingly, his wife Jessie said that, really, John came into this when he should have been going out of it. But he enjoyed 3 years of fame and of people loving him, not just for his music, but his personality as well.
Right. So the anonymity, that big long period that he spent in silence, it was actually just economics that sort of stopped OK Records and stopped the whole pathway for him in the blues?
It was pretty much economics. I mean, the Depression came in and the whole record industry crashed. But shortly after that, the Petrillo ban was introduced, which was a ban on recorded music that was introduced by a guy called Petrillo. This was in defense of live music. He thought that recording music was depriving live musicians out of a livelihood. So a lot of things came into play, and John just went back to being a farmer. That's what he had been before. He wasn't bitter about it because he never was a professional musician, and he just got on with his life in rural Mississippi.
Something really interesting about him is that when you see a tape of him, you mentioned that he was not bitter. He seems absolutely joyful and happy as he plays. There's this kind of we're going to have some fun right now. Let me start it out in the key of E. What was that in him? What made him such a happy musician and such a joyful player?
Well, one of the black musicians who was a very close friend of John's in the 60s was a guy called Jerry Ricks. And Jerry became a close friend of John's, and I've spoken to Jerry. And I asked him that question because I figured he'd have a better answer than anyone. And his answer was that John never felt bitter because he was comfortable with who he was. He was comfortable in his own skin. He didn't have a chip on his shoulder about anything. And the amazing thing to me was that he was suddenly thrust into a situation where virtually all his audiences on the East Coast were young white people. Mm-hmm. He'd never been used to anything like that, and yet he was entirely comfortable with it. One incredible story was that when he'd been rediscovered in '63, they got him into coffee houses and places with small audiences on the East Coast, and then they booked him for the 1963 Newport Folk Festival, and they shoved him on the stage in front of 18,000 people. And they just put him on stage, and the two guys, Dick Spotswood and Tom Hoskins, who were managing him, looked at one another and thought, what have we done? Is he going to be able to handle this? And this little black guy from Mississippi climbed onto the stage and sat himself down in front of 18,000 predominantly white, young, hippie kind of folk. And he said, how you all doing? I'm Mississippi John Hurt. Very comfortable, launched into his first song, which was C.C. Rider, and the music stopped, and there was a silence of 2 or 3 seconds, and the whole place erupted. And he had them eaten out of his hand. He was such a warm, spiritual kind of a guy. Yeah. And his personality, to my mind, and this comes over in my book, I hope, that his personality is as important and as big a deal as his music is.
And 18,000 people. Avalon was a town of what, about 100?
Yeah, the main centre of Avalon was probably 200 or 300 people.
300.
But I mean, when he was in Avalon, he just played for local parties and dances and stuff like that, you know.
And I think I said 1,800. I meant 18,000.
18,000.
My gracious me! Now, what's happening with his music right now? Because in Serendipity, this book came out at the same time that something's going on with his music. What's that all about?
Okay, well, this was an interesting story. That when I was doing the research on the book, I met up with Tom Hoskins' sister Suzanne. Tom Hoskins, the guy who had rediscovered John, sadly died a few years back. But I met his sister Suzanne, and I was talking to her, trying to get some information on what kind of a guy Tom Hoskins was. And she said, well, you're staying with me in Atlanta, Georgia there, and the room you're staying in, under the bed, there are 3 boxes, cardboard boxes, full of old papers and stuff that Tommy left. And if you'd like to take a look through those, you're welcome to do so. So this, to me, was like Aladdin's cave. I dived into these boxes, and the first priceless thing that came out of the boxes was a bundle of letters written in John's own handwriting that Tom had preserved. I mean, priceless historic items. That wasn't all. I got down to the bottom of the box, and there, in a brown paper parcel, were the original tapes that Tom had recorded in Mississippi in 1963. He had gone down there with a portable Amplex recorder, thinking that if he did find John hurt, nobody would believe him if he didn't have some evidence. So he took into John's shotgun cabin a little Amplex tape recorder, and he recorded 2 hours of conversations and music of Mississippi John Hurt. John was a little bit rusty, but it was clearly the man himself. He'd found Mississippi John Hurt. And so, cut a long story short, we've remastered these recordings, and they're now available in this little CD called Discovery.
Oh.
And it's priceless. It's conversations, there's roosters calling out in the yard, there's children playing, and there's a whole lot of really important historic stuff about John's life in Mississippi.
Wow, so right at the moment of discovery.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, well, you've been to several places, and you're going to several places. Where do you go next?
Well, we're heading off this afternoon up to Greenwood, Mississippi, where we're doing a book signing there. And I've got a lot of friends around that area who I've made during the course of the research.
Excellent.
So we're going to do some visiting on them.
Okay.
And no doubt we'll get covered with good southern hospitality. We usually do when we go around there.
Good.
And we're going to be touring around, as I say, Greenwood, and then we're going to come back to, we're going to be in the Clarksdale Cathead Festival, sign some books there, and then we're going to come back here to Jackson at the end of the week.
Good.
And do a
And
sign.
the B.B. King Blues Museum.
Sorry, I forgot that one
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
We're going to be at the B.B. King Museum,
And
then
New
after that,
Orleans.
we're heading down to New Orleans. We're going to have a week in New Orleans of a holiday. But we've got some great gigs there. We've got a really nice book signing lined up with some local musicians. And I'm actually going to be appearing on a local New Orleans radio show. So
All right.
that'll be a big thrill.
All at Octavia Books.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. We've been talking with Philip R. Ratcliffe. He's the author of Mississippi John Hurt, His Life, His Times, His Blues.
Thank you.